The front of the airplane is gone. Just gone. Where the nose used to be, there's now a gaping hole open to the sky. The navigator is dead. The bombardier is dead. The control cables are severed, dangling in the 200-mile-per-hour wind. And the pilot looks at those bare cables, wires that used to connect to a control system that no longer exists, and starts pulling them with his bare hands. For 10 minutes, he flies a 65,000-pound bomber using nothing but exposed wires and prayer. He landed it. This is the flight that aeronautical engineers said was physically impossible. Before we get into the desperate minutes when a pilot flew a plane that shouldn't have been flyable, you need to understand what the B-17 Flying Fortress was and why it became the symbol of American air power over Europe. Because this aircraft wasn't just another bomber, it was a legend, a machine that absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any other aircraft and kept flying. The B-17 earned its nickname, Flying Fortress, not through marketing, but through blood and fire over the skies of Germany. The stories of B-17s returning home with catastrophic damage became so common that they almost stopped being remarkable. Almost. But the story I'm about to tell you goes beyond anything the designers at Boeing ever imagined. This story pushes the boundaries of what we understand about aircraft, about human determination, and about the thin line between survival and death at 25,000 feet. Let me set the stage properly. The year is 1943, deep in the most dangerous period of the American strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. The 8th Air Force, the mighty 8th, is flying daily missions from bases in England, sending hundreds of heavy bombers into the heart of the Reich. These missions are savage. The Luftwaffe is throwing everything it has at the American formations. Messerschmitt 109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, twin-engine fighters armed with rockets and heavy cannons. And then there's the flak, the anti-aircraft artillery that fills the sky with bursting shells, turning the air into a deadly obstacle course of shrapnel and fire. Every mission is a gamble. Every takeoff might be your last. The statistical reality facing American bomber crews was terrifying. In 1943, the average life expectancy of 8 B-17 crew was about 15 missions. A combat tour was 25 missions. Do the math. Most crews didn't survive their tour. They were killed, wounded, or captured. The planes that carried them were shot down, crashed, or limped home so damaged they never flew again. The 8th Air Force lost more men than the entire United States Marine Corps in World War II. This wasn't a job. It was a death sentence that you showed up for every morning, climbed into a metal tube, and flew into hell. Now let me introduce you to the B-17 Flying Fortress itself, because understanding this aircraft is essential to understanding how our pilots survived what should have been unsurvivable. The B-17 was designed by Boeing in the mid-1930s as a heavy bomber capable of carrying significant bomb loads over long distances. It went through multiple variants during the war, with the B-17E, F, and G being the primary combat models used over Europe. The aircraft was big, 74 feet long, with a wingspan of almost 104 feet. Weighed about 36,000 pounds empty and could gross over 65,000 pounds fully loaded with fuel, bombs, and ammunition. 4 Wright R-1820 radial engines, each producing about 1,200 horsepower, pulled this massive machine through the sky at speeds up to 287 miles per hour. But the B-17's most remarkable feature wasn't its size or its speed. It was its ability to absorb damage. Boeing's engineers had built redundancy into every critical system. The aircraft had dual control cables running to the flight surfaces. It had multiple hydraulic systems. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that would automatically plug bullet holes. It had armor plating protecting the crew positions. And most importantly, it had a structural design that could withstand incredible punishment without catastrophic failure. The stories of B-17 survival are legendary. There's the all-American a B-17F that had its rear fuselage nearly severed by a collision with a German fighter. The tail section was hanging on by a few stringers and the skin, yet the pilot flew it home and landed safely. There's the B-17 that came back with over 1,000 bullet and shrapnel holes in its fuselage. There's the bomber that lost 2 engines on one side and still made it back to England flying on the remaining 2. Time and again, B-17s demonstrated a survivability that seemed almost supernatural. Crews developed an almost religious faith in their aircraft. They knew that if they could keep the plane in the air, it would bring them home. But every aircraft has its limits. And on this, the mission briefing that morning was like hundreds of others. The target was a German industrial facility producing war material that was killing Allied soldiers. The route would take the bombers across occupied France and into Germany, through some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. Flight concentrations were expected to be intense. Fighter opposition was anticipated. Losses were estimated at the usual grim percentages. The crews suited up in their heavy flight gear, leather jackets, fleece-lined boots, oxygen masks, and parachutes. They checked their personal equipment, survival kits, escape maps, and first aid supplies. They attended to the small rituals and superstitions that bomber crews developed to cope with the constant proximity of death. Some touched a lucky charm. Some said a prayer. Some just focused on the routine, pushing the fear down to a place where it couldn't paralyze them. The B-17 at the center of our story was one of hundreds in the formation that day. She was a veteran aircraft with a crew that had flown together through multiple missions. The pilot was a young man. Most bomber pilots were young, barely out of their teens, who had earned their command through skill and survival. He had seen friends die. He had nursed damaged aircraft back to base. He thought he had seen everything the war could throw at him. He was wrong. The takeoff was routine. The formation assembly over England was routine. The channel crossing was routine. The penetration into enemy territory began routine, with the usual increase in tension as the flak started reaching up toward them. The pilot and co-pilot flew their position in the combat box, maintaining the precise spacing that maximized the formation's defensive firepower. The gunners scanned the skies for enemy fighters. The navigator tracked their progress toward the target. The bombardier prepared for the bomb run. Everything was proceeding according to plan. And then a German shell hit the nose. Anti-aircraft shells were designed to explode at predetermined altitudes, filling the sky with shrapnel that would tear through aircraft and crew alike. Most shells exploded near aircraft, not inside them. But sometimes, rarely, terribly, a shell would score a direct hit. When that happened, the result was catastrophic. The shell that hit this B-17 struck the forward compartment, the glazed nose section where the bombardier and navigator worked. The explosion was devastating. The entire nose of the aircraft, several feet of structure, the bombardier station, the navigator's position, and the forward guns were simply gone, ripped away by the blast and the 200-mile-per-hour slipstream. The men in that compartment didn't have time to react, didn't have time to understand what was happening. One moment, they were alive, doing their jobs. The next moment, they were gone, along with the front of their airplane. Let me describe what the pilots saw when that shell hit, because that shouldn't exist. There was the physical shock of the aircraft bucking and yawing as its aerodynamics were suddenly, violently changed. There was the visual horror of looking forward from the cockpit and seeing, instead of the familiar nose section, open sky. Nothing but open sky. And there was the immediate, terrifying realization that his control yoke was dead. The explosion hadn't just destroyed the nose. It had severed the control cables that connected the cockpit to the flight control surfaces. When the pilot tried to move the yoke, nothing happened. The elevators and ailerons that control the aircraft's pitch and roll were no longer responding. The connection between the pilot and the plane had been cut. Now, let me explain how a B-17's flight control system worked, because this is crucial to understanding what happened next. Like most aircraft of its era, the B-17 used a mechanical control system. The pilot moved the yoke, the control wheel, in the cockpit, and that movement was transmitted through steel cables to the control surfaces on the wings and tail. Pull back on the yoke, and the cables pulled on the elevators, raising them and causing the nose to pitch up. Turn the yoke left, and the cables moved the ailerons, banking the aircraft to the left. The cables ran through the aircraft structure, routed through pulleys and guides, connecting the cockpit to the tail section and wingtips. In the B-17, these cables ran through the nose section and along the fuselage. When the nose was destroyed, some of these cables were severed. Not all of them. The B-17 had redundant cable runs. The aircraft was still flying, but it was flying uncontrolled, at the mercy of its own aerodynamics and whatever forces were acting on it. At this point, most pilots would have ordered the crew to bail out. The aircraft was catastrophically damaged. The control system appeared to be non-functional. The navigator and bombardier were dead or missing. The structural integrity of the aircraft was compromised. Every training manual, every instinct, every rational calculation said, "Get out now, before the plane goes into a spin or a dive and kills everyone aboard." But this pilot didn't order a bailout. Instead, he did something that shouldn't have worked. Something that the designers at Boeing had never anticipated. Something that, when the story was later told to aeronautical engineers, made them shake their heads in disbelief. He grabbed the bare control cables and started pulling them with his hands. Let me paint the picture of what this looked like, because the physical reality is almost absurd. The explosion had ripped open the forward section of the cockpit. Where there should have been instrument panels and structure, there was now a ragged hole open to the sky. The slipstream was howling through this hole at 200 miles per hour, creating a hurricane of wind and noise inside the cockpit. Pieces of debris were being sucked out. The temperature at 25,000 feet was around 40 degrees below zero, and that frozen air was now blasting directly into the aircraft. And there, exposed and dangling in this chaos, were the severed control cables, steel wires about the thickness of a pencil, their ends frayed where the explosion had torn them apart. The pilot couldn't use the yoke because the yoke was no longer connected to anything. But the cables were still connected to the control surfaces on the wings and tail. The physical linkage still existed, it wasn't routed through the normal control system anymore. In theory, if you could pull on those cables directly, you could move the flight controls. In theory, the pilot reached out into the windblast and grabbed a cable. The steel bit into his hands. He was wearing flight gloves, but the cables were still brutal on his grip. He pulled, and somewhere behind him, an elevator or an aileron moved. The aircraft responded. It wasn't a normal flight. It wasn't precise control, but it was something. The plane moved when he pulled the cables. He wasn't completely helpless. The next 10 minutes were the most intense of this pilot's life. He had to figure out which cable did what. In a normal control system, this is an intuitive pull back on the yoke. The nose goes up. But now he was dealing with individual cables, each one controlling a specific surface, and he had to learn by experimentation which cable made the plane do what. Pull this one, the nose goes up. Pull that one, the left wing drops. The feedback loop between input and response was completely alien, nothing like normal flying. And he had to do all of this while the wind screamed through the shattered nose, while the temperature froze his exposed skin, while the aircraft bucked and shuddered from its. Damage, while German flak continued to burst around them, while the rest of the formation flew on without them. The co-pilot was helping reach out to grab cables, following the pilot's instructions, trying to maintain some semblance of control over their wounded aircraft. The flight engineer came forward to assist, adding his hands to the effort. Together, the three men fought to keep the B-17 in the air pulling on raw steel cables with their bare hands, learning a new way to fly through pure trial and error. Every second was a victory. Every moment they stayed airborne was a moment they weren't spinning into the ground. The aircraft wanted to dive. With the nose section gone, the weight distribution had changed dramatically, and the plane was nose-heavy. The pilot had to constantly fight to keep the nose up, pulling on the elevator cables until his arms burned with fatigue. If he relaxed for even a moment, the B-17 would begin to nose over, and a dive at this altitude could quickly become unrecoverable. Let me talk about what the rest of the crew was doing during these desperate minutes. The B-17 typically carried a crew of 10: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners, ball turret, tail, and 2 waist gunners. The navigator and bombardier were gone with the nose. That left 8 men, and they weren't just sitting idle. The gunners were at their stations, scanning for enemy fighters that might try to finish off the crippled bomber. A wounded B-17 separated from his formation was easy prey for the Luftwaffe. The radio operator was trying to contact other aircraft in the formation, letting them know the situation, hoping that someone might be able to assist. The flight engineer was moving through the aircraft, assessing damage, trying to determine functional, preparing for whatever came next. The B-17 was still over Germany. They had miles to go before reaching friendly territory, and every one of those miles would be a battle against physics and the damage to their aircraft. The pilot made a critical decision. He wasn't going to try to make it back to England. The aircraft was too badly damaged, and the control was too marginal. Instead, he would try to reach the emergency landing fields in liberated territory airstrips closer to the front lines, where damaged aircraft could put down without attempting the long crossing of the channel. It was still a long way, but it was closer than England. It was survivable if everything went right. But here's the thing about flying a critically damaged aircraft. Nothing goes right. Everything is a struggle. Every moment brings a new crisis. The wind through the shattered nose was creating aerodynamic effects that the pilot couldn't fully predict. The aircraft would suddenly yaw or pitch without warning, and he would have to react instantly, pulling on the cables to correct before the motion became uncontrollable. His hands were bleeding inside his gloves, the steel cables having worn through the leather and into his skin. The cold was affecting his dexterity, making it harder to grip the cables, harder to apply the precise force needed for control. And the fatigue was building. The human body isn't designed to fight a constant physical battle while simultaneously making life or death decisions in a hostile environment. The pilot was running on adrenaline and willpower, and both were finite resources. The formation had moved on, unable to slow down for a single damaged aircraft. The B-17 was alone now, limping across the sky, gradually losing altitude distance. Every 1,000 feet lower meant slightly warmer air, slightly more oxygen, slightly less strain on the damaged systems. But it also meant getting closer to the range of German ground defenses, closer to where enemy fighters could more easily intercept them. The pilot had to balance these factors, descending fast enough to survive, but not so fast that he flew into new dangers. They crossed out of German airspace and into occupied France. The flak died away, though the threat of fighters remained. Below them, the landscape was still enemy territory, but the front lines were getting closer. Allied forces were pushing through France, liberating towns and cities, establishing those emergency airfields that the pilot was counting on. If he could just keep the aircraft in the air a little longer, if he could just find one of those fields, if his hands could just hold on to those cables for a few more miles. Let me describe the landing approach, because this was where all the desperate improvisation of the flight would either pay off or kill everyone aboard. Landing a B-17 is challenging even under normal conditions. The aircraft weighs tens of thousands of pounds, travels at over 100 miles per hour on final approach, and requires precise control inputs to flare and touch down safely. Landing a B-17 by pulling on raw control cables. With the nose section destroyed, the aerodynamics completely altered, and no functioning instruments? That's not a landing. That's a controlled crash at best. The pilot found an airfield, one of the emergency strips set up to receive damaged aircraft. The runway was visible below, a strip of clear ground with emergency vehicles standing by. He began his approach. Descending toward the field, trying to manage his speed and altitude using techniques he was inventing on the fly. The co-pilot and engineer were still helping with the cables, responding to the pilot's shouted instructions, fighting to keep the aircraft stable as it slowed and descended. The approach was terrifying for everyone involved. The aircraft was wallowing, barely under control, responding sluggishly to the desperate cable pulling. The pilot couldn't see his instruments properly. Many of them had been destroyed in the explosion, and those that remained were useless without normal control inputs to interpret. He was flying by feel, by instinct, by the seat of his pants. The ground was rushing up at them. The runway was ahead. Everything depended on the next few seconds. The landing was rough. The B-17 hit the ground hard, bouncing once, twice, before settling onto its wheels. The tires screamed on the runway. The brakes, thankfully, were still functional, and the pilot applied them hard, fighting to slow the aircraft before it ran off the end of the strip. The aircraft shuddered and groaned, metal grinding on metal, systems that had been pushed beyond all limits finally giving way. And then, miraculously, impossibly, the B-17 stopped. They were on the ground. They were alive. The crew evacuated the aircraft as quickly as they could. Damaged B-17s had a tendency to catch fire, and nobody wanted to survive the flight only to die in the wreck. Ground personnel rushed to assist, astonished at the condition of the aircraft. Descending toward the cockpit, he was exhausted beyond words, running on nothing but the dregs of adrenaline. But he was alive. His crew, at least those who had survived the initial explosion, were alive. They had done the impossible. Now let me zoom out and talk about what this story tells us about the B-17, about bomber crews, and about the nature of survival in combat. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed to be tough, but nobody at Boeing had ever imagined a scenario where a pilot would fly the aircraft by pulling on exposed control cables. The redundancy built into the control system had partially worked. There were still cables connected to the flight's surfaces even after the nose was destroyed. But using those cables directly, bypassing the normal control mechanisms, was never part of the design. The pilot improvised a solution that shouldn't have worked, using the raw physical connection between his hands and the flight surfaces to control a multi-ton aircraft. This is not something that can be trained. You can't practice flying a B-17 by pulling on exposed cables. There's no simulator for that. What the pilot did was pure improvisation under pressure, adapting to circumstances that nobody had anticipated, finding a way when there shouldn't have been a way. That's the kind of ingenuity and determination that won the air war over Europe. The B-17's toughness was legendary, but came at a cost. The aircraft was heavy, relatively slow, and not particularly maneuverable. German fighter pilots learned to exploit its weaknesses, attacking from angles where the defensive guns. The head-on attack approaching the bomber from directly ahead became a favored Luftwaffe tactic because the B-17's forward firepower was limited, and a fighter could close the distance and open fire before the bomber's guns could track it effectively. This is why so many B-17s suffered damage to their nose sections. The Germans knew that hitting the nose could kill the bombardier and navigator, destroy the bomb site, and potentially disable the aircraft's control systems. The shell that hit our pilot's B-17 was almost certainly fired as part of this deliberate targeting of the nose. But the B-17 absorbed the hit and kept flying. That was the aircraft's genius. It was designed to take punishment that would destroy other bombers and still bring its crew home. The self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires. The armor plating protected the crew from shrapnel. The redundant control cables provided backup when primary systems failed. Every B-17 that made it home with severe damage was a testament to the engineers who designed it and the workers who built it. Those workers were mostly women, by the way, the famous Rosie the Riveters who staffed the factories while men were overseas fighting. They built aircraft that saved lives, one rivet at a time, and the crews who flew those aircraft owed their survival to the quality of American manufacturing. Let me tell you about the aftermath of this particular flight, because the story didn't end when the aircraft touched down. The pilot was evacuated to a medical facility for treatment of his injuries, primarily the damage to his hands and the frostbite from the sub-zero wind blast. He would recover, but his hand would never be quite the same. The constant pulling on steel cables had torn tendons and damaged nerves. For the rest of his life, he would carry physical reminders of those 10 minutes when he flew a plane that couldn't be flown. The surviving crew members were debriefed, and their accounts were recorded for the official record. The story was so remarkable that it was flagged for special attention, and engineers from Boeing were eventually informed. Their reaction was skepticism followed by amazement. They examined the wreckage, studied the damage, and tried to understand how control had been maintained. Their conclusion was that the pilot had accomplished something that bordered on the miraculous, finding a way to fly that their engineering models had never considered, improvising a control technique that shouldn't have been possible. The aircraft itself was a write-off. There was no question of repairing a B-17 that had lost its entire nose section. The fuselage was structurally compromised, and the effort required to rebuild it would have been better spent building a new aircraft from scratch. The wreck was stripped of usable parts, engines, instruments, guns, and anything that could be salvaged, and the rest was scrapped. One more B-17 was added to the toll of the air war, though this one had at least brought most of its crew home before dying. The pilot was eventually awarded medals for his actions, though the specific decorations varied, depending on who was telling the story. What's certain is that his commanding officers recognized that he had a determination that went far beyond normal duty. He became a legend within his unit, one of those stories that old-timers told new arrivals to illustrate what the B-17 could do and what kind of men flew them. I want to talk about the psychology of what this pilot did, because the mental aspects of his survival are as remarkable as the physical aspects. When the shell hit and the nose disappeared, the pilot had a split second to make a decision that would determine whether he and his crew lived or died. The rational choice, the choice that training and instinct would both suggest, was to order an immediate bailout. The aircraft was catastrophically damaged. The control system appeared to be non-functional. Staying with the plane seemed like suicide. But the pilot didn't order a bailout. Why? Part of the answer is probably that he didn't have time to think it through. In crisis situations, people often act on instinct rather than deliberation. The pilot's instinct was to fly the aircraft. That's what he was trained to do. That's what he had been doing moments before the shell hit. When the yoke went dead, his instinct wasn't to give up. It was to find another way to fly. The fact that another way meant grabbing exposed cables and pulling on them was improvisation, but the underlying drive was pure instinct. Keep flying, keep the aircraft in the air, don't give up. Part of the answer is also the bond that develops between a pilot and his crew. Those men in the back of the aircraft, the gunners, the radio operator, were depending on him. If he ordered a bailout, some of them might not make it. Parachuting over enemy territory was dangerous. Many bailout survivors became prisoners of war, and some were killed by civilians or executed by German troops. If the pilot could keep the aircraft flying long enough to reach friendly territory, his crew would have a much better chance of survival. That responsibility, that awareness that other lives depended on his decisions, kept him focused and fighting when personal survival instincts might have told him to jump. And part of the answer is simply that this pilot was exceptional. Not every person can perform under extreme pressure. Not every pilot could have improvised the solution that he did. Some combination of training, experience, personality, and sheer will allowed him to do what most people couldn't have done. That's not a criticism of other pilots. It's recognition that survival in extreme situations often depends on factors that can't be fully explained or replicated. Sometimes the right person is in the right place at the right time, and they do something extraordinary. Let me zoom out even further and place this story in the context of the broader air war. The 8th Air Force flew thousands of missions over Europe between 1942 and 1945. They dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs on German targets. They destroyed factories, rail yards, bridges, and military installations. They engaged in massive aerial battles in action. Thousands more were wounded, captured, or became prisoners of war. They lost over 4,000 heavy bombers, B-17s, and B-24s shot down over enemy territory or crashed on return. They suffered the highest casualty rate of any major American combat unit in the war. The men who flew these missions knew the statistics. They knew that every time they took off, they were gambling with their lives. And they flew anyway, mission after mission, because they believed in what they were doing. They believed that destroying Germany's industrial capacity was essential to winning the war. They believed that their sacrifice was worth it. And in the end, they were right. The strategic bombing campaign, for all its cost, contributed significantly to Germany's defeat. The B-17s that flew these missions became symbols of American determination and industrial power. The Germans called them Wehrmacht, 4 engines, and learned to fear the formations that darkened the skies over the Reich. The bombers kept coming, wave after wave, absorbing losses that would have stopped any other air force, and still pressing forward to their targets. Individual aircraft became legends. Memphis Belle, the first B-17 to complete 25 missions, all-American, which flew home despite having its tail nearly severed, and dozens of others whose stories are less famous, but no less remarkable. Our pilot's aircraft, with its missing nose and cable-controlled landing, takes its place in this pantheon of survivor stories. It's a reminder that the B-17 was not just a machine. It was an extension of its crew. Our pilot did, because there are lessons here for anyone interested in aviation or engineering. Flying an aircraft by pulling on exposed control cables is not something that should work. The control cables in a B-17 were designed to be operated through a system of pulleys, bell cranks, and linkages that translated the pilot's yoke movements into appropriate deflections of the control surfaces. When the pilot moved the yoke, the cables moved, but they moved through a carefully designed mechanical path that ensured smooth, proportional control inputs. By pulling on the cables directly, the pilot was bypassing this entire system. He had no way to know exactly how much cable movement corresponded to how much control surface deflection. He had no way to get the proportional, nuanced control that normal flying required. He was essentially on-off. Pull the cable, the surface moves. Release the cable, it returns to neutral. Flying like this required completely relearning how to control the aircraft. Every instinct the pilot had developed through hundreds of hours of flight training was suddenly useless. He had to develop new instincts on the fly, figuring out through trial and error how to make the crippled aircraft go where he wanted it to go. The fact that he succeeded tells us something important about human adaptability. The human brain is remarkably flexible when it comes to controlling external systems. Give a person a novel control interface, a joystick, a steering wheel, a pair of cables, and they will, with practice, learn to use it effectively. The pilot didn't have time for years of experience understanding how aircraft respond to control inputs. He knew what the aircraft should do when the elevators moved, when the ailerons deflected, when the rudder swung. He could observe the aircraft's behavior and correlate it with his cable pulling, building a mental model of how this new control system worked. That mental model was imperfect, but it was good enough. Good enough to keep the aircraft flying. Good enough to make it to the emergency field. Good enough to land, barely, but successfully. The other remarkable aspect of the pilot's success was the physical endurance it required. Pulling on steel cables for 10 minutes might not sound like much, but consider the conditions. The cables were under tension from the airflow over the control surfaces. Pulling them required significant force, not just a light tug. Have been overwhelmed, would have made mistakes, would have lost control of the aircraft or themselves. This pilot held it together, compartmentalizing the fear and pain and fatigue, focusing on the immediate task of keeping his aircraft in the air. Let me talk about the crew's role in this survival story, because the pilot couldn't have done alone. The co-pilot was essentially an extra pair of hands to grab cables, an extra mind to help solve problems, and an extra set of eyes to watch for threats and obstacles. The flight engineer contributed his technical knowledge, helping to assess the damage and suggesting solutions. The rest of the crew maintained their stations, providing defensive firepower against potential fighter attacks, monitoring the aircraft's systems for additional failures, and generally keeping the crew functional as a unit. Bomber crews trained together, flew together, and often died together. They developed a cohesion and trust that allowed them to function effectively even in the most chaotic circumstances. This crew's cohesion was tested to its limits during those 10 minutes, and they passed the test. The loss of the navigator and bombardier was devastating, both personally and professionally. These men were friends, crewmates, and companions through numerous missions. Their deaths were violent, sudden, and essentially witnessed by the rest of the crew. The psychological impact of seeing your friends killed, of having their workspace suddenly erased and replaced by open sky, must have been immense. But the surviving crew members couldn't afford to process that trauma in the moment. They had to. Adaptability, determination, endurance, and creativity are the same qualities that have allowed humans to survive and thrive in challenging environments throughout history. They're not qualities that can be programmed into a computer. They're uniquely human. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed to bring its crews home. It succeeded in that mission thousands of times during World War II, absorbing damage that would have destroyed other aircraft and limping back to bases in England where exhausted crews would stumble out on a solid ground and thank whatever gods they believed in. But the B-17 was just a machine. It couldn't save itself. It needed human beings to fly it, to fight for it, to refuse to give up on it. The pilot of our story did all of those things. When his aircraft was mortally wounded, when all normal options had been exhausted, he found a way to keep flying. He turned an impossible situation into a survival story. He brought his crew home. So yeah, now you know how one pilot flew a B-17 for 10 minutes by pulling on bare control cables. You know about the shell that destroyed the nose, the severed cables, the 200-mile-per-hour wind blast. You know about the desperate improvisation, the bleeding hands, the impossible landing. You know about the B-17 Flying Fortress and why it earned its legendary reputation. And you know that when everything else fails, sometimes human determination is enough to cheat death. You're welcome. That's going to cost you one subscription, or drop a comment telling me which B-17 story you want to hear next. If you want more on impossible survivals and the bombers that shouldn't have made it home, click the video right here. Because this wasn't the only B-17 that did the impossible, and the next video explains what other crews did when their aircraft should have killed them. The math doesn't work. 2,700 Japanese soldiers, 33 Marines. That's 82 enemies for every single American. The Japanese commander looks at those numbers and sees a guaranteed victory, a slaughter, a footnote in history. But one sergeant looks at those same numbers and says, they're not getting through. For the next 10 hours, he turns a machine gun into a wall of fire. Bodies pile up in front of his position. His gun barrel glows red. His hands burn. He keeps shooting. When the sun rises, the Japanese force is shattered, and this sergeant is standing on a pile of 950 enemy dead. This is the night they try to break the Marines. This is the night one man said no. Before we get into the carnage and chaos of that October night in 1942, you need to understand why Guadalcanal mattered. Because this wasn't just some random Pacific island that happened to see fighting. This was the hinge point of the entire Pacific War. This was where America stopped retreating and started advancing. This was where the Japanese juggernaut finally hit something it couldn't crush. Let me set the stage properly. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and launched simultaneous invasions across the Pacific. Within 6 months, they had conquered an empire stretching from the borders of India to the islands of the Central Pacific. Hong Kong fell. Singapore fell. The Philippines fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. Burma fell. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. Their Zero fighters dominated the skies. Their long lance torpedoes sank Allied ships with terrifying efficiency. Their soldiers fought with a fanaticism that shocked Western observers. The rising sun was ascending, and nothing seemed capable of stopping it.